in every DUI case, it is impossible for the state to know exactly what your BAC was at the time of driving because they're not drawing your blood on the side of the road right after pulling you over. I mean, they need to have probable cause. They need to do their investigation. They're arresting you for DUI. So generally, your blood is not going to be taken until 1, 2, 3. We've had cases where blood was taken even 4 to 5 hours afterwards. In those type of situations, we've had cases where blood was taken 4 or 5 hours afterwards. Our clients are, a 0.05 or a 0.06 or close to that 0.08. But the state tries to say, well, at the time of driving 5 hours earlier, and they do something called retrograde extrapolation, which is how they try to show through science and through, a bunch of data what that BAC was at the time of driving versus at the time of the actual blood draw. So first off, what is retrograde extrapolation?
What the state means when they try to argue that is that they're arguing that the blood is going down from where it was at the time of driving. So when your example, right, of somebody being stopped and they're a 0.05 or a 0.06, 4 or 5 hours after the time that they were seized during the arrest, is what they're arguing with the national average is that everybody metabolizes alcohol at about a 0.015 per hour. Now, that is an average. That is by no means the way that it actually works for, individual people. But what they're trying to say is that if we use that average and add it on to the time difference, whether that's, 2 hours and trying to argue that's a 0.03 higher, is that's what your blood would have been at the time of driving. Because, for most of our cases, where somebody is over the legal limit, the prosecutor usually holds up a blood result and says, well, this is what it was at the time of driving. With retrograde, they have to try to argue that that national average would put you over. And further, what they're trying to argue there is that was when you were at your peak, right? Not that your blood was still going up or that it was going down. Is that at the time of driving, that was the highest that you were.
Right, and I guess that's the main issue with retrograde extrapolation is that the state, almost always the experts presume that you were at your peak at the time of driving, but alcohol in the human body is like a bell curve, and so you're a 0.02 at 2 separate points, right? You're a 0.02 at the beginning, then you go to a 0.03, 0.04, and you go up to whatever the BAC is at your peak, and then you go back down and you go back down to that 0.02 as well. The problem with the state's argument is that they assume national averages of metabolism rates and elimination rates. And there's other various factors that go into the data that they do without taking the individual's body into account and the individual's metabolism and elimination rate, right? So you and I both can drink the same amount of beer in the same amount of time, and still have a different BAC. We look at weight differences. We look at, female versus male. We look at what they ate that day. So someone who hasn't ate all day is going to have a lot thinner of a, bell curve where that peak is going to go pretty quickly and go back down pretty quickly with the absorption or elimination rate. Whereas someone who, has a lot more tolerance to alcohol, drinks a lot more, weighs more, and ate a lot that day, that alcohol or that food in their body is going to help decrease that elimination rate, can slow it down. And so when we look at that, we can see that elimination rate even, went a lot slower. So, when the state assumes a specific elimination rate of a 0.015, it could be a lot lower than that, meaning that the BAC is a lot closer to what it was at the time of the blood draw. There are significant issues with retrograde extrapolation. There are way too many averages that are taken into account. And when we, cross-examine officers and look at the literature on retrograde extrapolation, there are very easy ways to look at that bell curve and try to show that those presumptions are based on these peaks that they can't actually prove. And especially because a lot of the times officers don't investigate or ask the specific questions they need to, or they may not get, exact answers that are actually what occurred. So I can take shots right now, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, go drive a vehicle, get pulled over in 5 minutes, do field sobriety tests in 10 minutes, and be off the road within 15 to 20 minutes. Well, I could assure you my BAC at that time is very likely not going to be at that 0.08 because I just drank that alcohol. My body's going to have to absorb, metabolize it before I get to that peak level. Well, if my blood isn't taken until an hour later, I very well from those 5 back-to-back shots of alcohol is going to be above a 0.08. And that's the issue with both retrograde extrapolation and also rising BACs, is that your BAC can rise from the time that you were driving to the time of the blood draw through your body metabolizing that alcohol. And then we talk about absorption, that's when we talk about the retrograde extrapolation issues with that. So significant issues with retrograde extrapolation, significant issues with potential rising BACs. The state can never definitively establish beyond a reasonable doubt what that BAC was at the time of driving. There are far too many assumptions that they make in order to get to those numbers, and they always give a range. But even that range, when we take it outside of the average person and look at our client specifically, potentially falls out of that range. And the way that it is convincing as a DUI defense attorney is looking at the person themselves. Look at the body cam, look at the dash cam, look at what our clients look like. There's 24 potential cues of impairment during the vehicle in motion, 28 during the personal contact. Does the person have slurred speech, unsteadiness on feet, red, watery, bloodshot eyes? We look at all these factors, and if our client looks sober, doesn't look like someone who's impaired, they walk like a duck, quack like a duck, they're probably a duck. Well, if we can try to show that the person was not impaired, but then the state's showing you a piece of paper that just says what a BAC is or what it may have been at the time of driving, becomes a lot more convincing that they didn't show what the level was at the time of driving, and it's not reliable because of that.
Yeah. And we have plenty of cases where somebody's just left the bar, like your example, right? We'll have a case where it's something like a speeding stop, right? Non-DUI indicator, right? Anybody can speed. It's not an indicator of DUI. They look good, they sound good, but there's the odor of alcohol, and they're, might be late night and they have red eyes. The officer has them do fields and arrest them. At that point, their BAC could be well under the legal limit.
Yeah.
And then, they try to argue that, oh, well, if it's rising, but then if they have to still try to argue retrograde extrapolation, if you look good in the video, it just hamstrings their argument.
Yeah.
So like Brandon talked about, just the importance of the body camera and how you look, how you sound in that video.
Yeah. Every case is different. We need to analyze every detail of a DUI case. You can't just get a BAC back that's above a 0.08 and say, I'm guilty, because there's plenty of legal defenses, both as to whether or not the officers prolong the investigations in the proper manners with the proper amount of evidence, but also can the state prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. So various issues that we need to be able to litigate, discuss, and try to avoid DUI. When it comes to defending DUI cases, the body cam footage is so critical. I mean, people oftentimes see a BAC above a 0.15, for example, or a 0.2, and they think that they're automatically doomed. But there's issues as far as, well, is it admissible? Can that blood result be admissible and be used against me in court? And if there's arguments that it cannot be used against you, the blood alcohol content does not matter if they can't use it against you. If they can use it against you, then we look at, well, is that blood sample reliable? Can a jury believe that number that's on the piece of paper? Oftentimes we discuss at trial, things in voir dire, such as, every year I get $5,000 from the IRS. This year the IRS sent me a letter and said, hey, you owe me $15,000, right? Do we automatically believe the government because it's the IRS and just write them a check, $15,000? Here you go. Thank you, IRS, for everything you do. Or do you question that number on that piece of paper? Do you call them and say, why do I owe you $15,000 this year when you've paid me $5,000 every year? The same issue with blood alcohol content, right? Do we just take the number because it's on a piece of paper and automatically find the person guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Of course not. We would not defend DUI cases with blood alcohol content if they were automatically guilty. They'd show up to the court date with the blood alcohol content and they'd be guilty. There'd be no defenses, right? But reliability of that sample can be questioned in various different ways, starting off with the actual taking of the blood itself. Let's talk about some issues with the taking of the blood. So 10 milliliters of blood, they're supposed to get 2 tubes, vials. One is tested by the state, one is available for the defense to, test independently to verify the results. What type of issues do we discuss when we look at that blood sample?
Yeah, so one of the first things we're looking for about the blood itself is we're looking to see, did they get enough? Really, the range on that is going to be around 9.3 to about 10.7. Mm-hmm. When we see a blood result under that, we may have some issues as far as whether bacteria or other issues could be caused by the blood. If the vacuum on the tube when they were filling it with blood is broken. If bacteria is getting in there, that can turn into ethyl alcohol, which is going to lead to you having a higher BAC than you might otherwise have, right? So your 0.15 may be completely distorted based on what it actually was for something that you can't even control, whether it was a poor draw or whether it was defective equipment. Is that indicative of what you actually were at the time of driving?
Yeah, that tube not being sealed can cause, like Andrew said, bacteria to grow. Bacteria becomes ethanol, increases that sample. We can't show definitively how much it increased, but if we have someone who looks good on video, who doesn't have slurred speech, who isn't showing, the 28 cues of impairment during the personal contact phase, didn't have bad driving, stop for speeding, whatever it might be, if the person does not look impaired but has a high blood alcohol content, that's one of the things that we can say, hey, you can't trust this blood sample. Clearly it is not reliable. Clearly something had to have happened. One thing that we can potentially point to is that, vacuum being broken or not sealed properly. A good example that we look at is, eating a turkey and, salami sandwich or, an Italian sub, whatever it might be. I'm eating that sandwich and I'm full and I just leave it on the table, right? And I forget about it. I go to bed and then the next day I wake up and I see that turkey sandwich. It looks the same as it did the day before. I don't see any green on it or anything suspicious, just like I don't see anything suspicious on that blood sample, right? I'll guarantee you, and you've probably been told before, you don't eat that sandwich that next day if it's not in that, that refrigerator. Same thing with the blood. If it's not stored at 4 degrees Celsius to negative 4 degrees Celsius, if it doesn't have that 9.3 to 10.7, it's not a blood sample that you can rely upon, especially if we look at the person and they don't look impaired. Okay. That is one thing that we could point to as why that blood sample may not be reliable. Something else that we can see on the blood or on the body cam is inversions of the tube, right? It's not just shaking the tube, it's inverting it. So every tube has a gray tube top on the top, and it has at the very bottom 20 milliliters of sodium fluoride, and it has 100 milliliters of potassium oxalate. So potassium oxalate is an anticoagulant, make sure that the blood does not clot. The sodium fluoride is a preservative. The point of those preservatives and the anti-clotting mechanisms being at the bottom of that tube is to, once again, ensure that because that blood sample is not tested immediately that day, it preserves that sample over time. Well, if it sits at the bottom, it's just like having emergency or having pre-workout, anything like that. It all goes to the very bottom, and then the water goes on top of it. In our case, the blood goes on top of it. The only way to ensure that it mixes properly based on their standard operating procedures is to do 8 inversions. 1, 2, 3, so on until we get to 8. That is how it mixes in, and we ensure the validity of that sample. That's one thing we're able to see on body cam. In every single case, if they don't invert it 8 times, there is an argument that that blood sample may be compromised. It may not be reliable. The sugar could have, bacteria could have grown. It becomes ethanol, turns into, which is alcohol, increases the blood alcohol content. We cannot definitively say what the BAC in that tube would have been, but for the inversions, but for not having the proper, amount of blood in that sample, the 9.3 to 10.7. What we can say is this may have been an issue that compromised that blood alcohol content. And if we have someone who looks good on video, who doesn't look like the blood alcohol content that you would expect based on, countless literature that says that certain BACs, what indicators an individual would have, that is why we can point to and say, did the state prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt? Did they prove that I owe them $15,000 this year instead of getting $5,000 in the mail? Well, again, it all comes down to the reliability of that blood sample. How do we question it? And we have to question it in every single case when a client looks good, because there's a disconnect between the person and what that blood alcohol content is. There has to be a reason, and the state needs to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that those issues did not occur, did not compromise that sample, and that person is above a 0.08 or was driving under the influence. Because the state's case to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not our case to prove.
No.
We just need to prove that there's reasonable doubt to question the state and whether or not they have proven their case that they have the burden of beyond a reasonable doubt. Yeah.
To your point from earlier, you're talking about challenging it. There's a reason that we don't just go in, say I'm guilty just because it's a 0.15 or a 0.2. Is we've all had cases. I think the one out east, more rural jurisdiction, EMS is called out to do the blood draw. There's just some obvious issues from the start. It's clear that they did not fill it up with enough. They didn't do any inversions. And you have a guy that's showing only 2 indicators. It's a late night and his eyes are red, and he tells them, yeah, I did have a beer earlier. Looks great in the video, looks great on field sobriety testing, for the most part. And after all that, blood comes back into 0.18.
Yeah.
And there's just, it defies logic. And so that's why it's just because you see that blood draw doesn't always mean it's going to be reliable.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why, again, it's so imperative to hire a DUI defense attorney who's going to question every aspect of that case, and not just take a blood alcohol content and say, hey, you're above a 0.15, that's 7 days in jail. I can get you 48 hours in jail. You should plead guilty to it. I'm not saying that we can get someone out of every single DUI case, right? But there are issues that need to be addressed, and we have to look at every detail with a fine comb to see if there is a way to avoid a DUI conviction to accomplish our client's goals, and potentially whether or not we can convince a jury that the state has not proved their case beyond that reasonable doubt.